Coming to you from the last video store in the universe, it's Binge Movies 163. I'm Jason. This is the show that ranks and eliminates movies, determine which ones are most worthy of preservation for all time, even beyond the end times. On this episode, the first 5 films of the Criterion Collection. I'm joined this week for the season premiere of Binge Movies by film Twitter glitterati, film Twitter celebrity, film Twitter I don't know what category to put you in other than like 3 years ago I got bombarded by a bunch of people saying you need to have this person on your show, and so then we followed each other, and then it's taken 3 years for me to get you on, but it's finally happening. And it's happening because once a week you have a haul from the Criterion Collection on your social media. I have the pleasure of speaking with Kate Bush expert, Kate Bush meme-ifier.
Yes.
Film Twitter, like I said, glitterati, Barnes & Noble supporter, potential stakeholder, shareholder. You've seen her tweets, you know her. I'm talking about Molly Raspberry. How are you, Molly?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm okay. I have no idea. I've had exchanges with you in the past. I have no idea how old you are. You could be 60 years old. You could be 22 years old. Not that I need to know your age, but your references span the amount of time. You're more adept at social media than I am. So I know you're probably in your 20s-ish.
Close. I'm actually in my early 30s, but I've been acting like that since I was a teenager.
Yeah, all of your references are old-timey.
I was, even in high school, I became a fan of Thomas Pynchon, which actually is a character. There's a character in Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. And if you read the Criterion booklet, speaking of Criterion, you'll see that he's read Gravity's Rainbow and is very upset that he has no high school teachers to talk to about it because no one else has read it. And I was like, that was me. That high schooler, Richard Linklater, how did you know?
So you're the perfect guest for this because you're already talking about reading Criterion booklets. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, but let's start with, before we dive into these movies, let's start with what Criterion is for those who are listening. If you're listening to this show and you don't know what Criterion is, I find it doubtful, but there might be some people. The Criterion Collection is essentially like a North American home video distribution company that started a number of years ago for the purpose of preserving and distributing significant works of art and popular films. So because they have a unique mix of movies, this isn't just old-timey black and white shit, although that's what we're going to be talking about today. For the purpose of sort of preserving and celebrating the great works of film and significant works of film. So which is really interesting, so you're going to get anything from a Cronenberg to a Fellini to a Truffaut to Repo Men. So,
yes.
You'll get all kind of stuff that's in the Criterion Collection. And a little bit of crossover here. One of the founders of the Criterion Collection, of the two men who founded it, is film producer, Joe Medjuck, who is most famous for producing Ghostbusters. So you have Ghostbusters to thank for the Criterion Collection. You're welcome, world. You're welcome, cinema. Let me ask you a question. If Zack Snyder went into the Criterion closet, what movie do you think he'd pick? What couple of movies?
Let's see. I think he would like Repo Man. I think he would like Repo Man, but I also think he'd like the classics. He loves Seven Samurai, I think, because especially 300, you could see that influence right there. Or if they still had Ron in there, if it wasn't out of print, thanks Studio Canal, then definitely that would be one of them. Yeah. And I think also Watership Down, I think he'd also really like too, because he did The Owls of Ga'Hoole, and that's one of his favorite films he's ever done. So I could see that with anthropomorphic animals in there. And it's so hard to pick pick some. I'm just gonna go on a whim and say Bicycle Thieves as well. Maybe he likes Bicycle Thieves because he's like, yeah.
Now you gotta pick one movie. Kate Bush goes in the Criterion closet. What movie should she pick?
What movie would she pick? Oh,
just one.
I'm just wondering if she already has it, because she'd already have The Red Shoes, because that's one of her favorite movies, and everything David Lean she loves, and she loves Nicholas Roeg. She loves Don't Look Now. It's also one of her favorite movies too. So it's so hard to pick. Probably 4K Red Shoes, because she made an entire movie inspired by that. She was friends with Michael Powell before he passed away. So if you could do your just like six, like the Kevin Bacon, just like 6 names away from Kevin Bacon, but the 6 names away from Kate Bush, just like, oh no, Kate Bush, she has very close ties with Martin Scorsese because she was friends with Michael Powell, and she was also friends with Robert De Niro when she met him during Brazil, because she's close with Terry Gilliam, and apparently they went to a Van Morrison concert in the 90s, which I think is hilarious.
So here's when I look at your Twitter account, the thing that I always ask myself is, how does one brain contain all of this?
I could go into a long-winded discussion, or I could just say ADHD. I have a very hyperactive brain. A very hyperactive brain. That's where my hyperactive.
Now, you work at a library?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I use bookstore part-time, but mostly the library, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, now it's been 20 years, maybe not quite 20. Oh, that's scary to think. But I worked at a library all throughout university. It's how I helped pay my way through college, was working at the university library. Mm-hmm. Of all of the both student and faculty librarians I worked with, you'd fit right in. So it makes perfect sense, because the encyclopedic knowledge of a wide variety of topics. Mm-hmm. You're like a human Dewey Decimal System.
I feel like I think so. That's why people are just like, are you a reference librarian? I'm like, I'm sort of am. I would go, and I even work at the bookstore, and they'd be like, I'm looking for this book. It's just like, it's blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, it's Colleen Hoover. Or it's like, oh, you're looking for Paradise of the Blind, because that's been a high school thing. It's like, how did you know? I'm like, you're in high school, right? And you mentioned Vietnam book. It's either going to be that, or because that's what I studied to be like, okay, what's on the reading list right now? And I studied the New York Times bestsellers, and I'm just like, so I'm always one step ahead. So I always know, just like, oh,
look at you. You were probably born after card catalogs, but you are the modern equivalent of a card catalog. That's a compliment.
Yeah, thank you.
So I can't think of a more perfect person to talk about. I mean, my gosh, Renoir, yes. Truffaut, Kurosawa, Fellini. We're talking about 1937's A Grand Illusion, which was the first film ever selected for the Criterion Collection. The second film ever selected was Akira Kurosawa's 1954 classic Seven Samurai. The third film ever chosen was Alfred Hitchcock's 1938, The Lady Vanishes. The fourth film ever chosen was Fellini's 1974, Amarcord. And then we have 1959, which is the fifth film chosen, Truffaut's 400 Blows. So we've got French New Wave. We've got the almost 30th film Alfred Hitchcock ever worked on, but it's the one that got him seen by Hollywood and brought him over to the States. We've got Fellini we got so many of these movies are autobiographical because auteurs love to make movies about themselves and their troubled boyhoods. Yes. We've got murder mysteries. We've got train plots. We've got men on a mission films. We've got epic war sagas, epic Italian adolescent boyhood fantasies. We had so many things to get into. Without much further ado, I'm looking at my watch. I think it is about that time. Let's start with 1937's Grand Illusion, which currently has a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes.
We have a minute left. If we were loading on the Ark now, and you could grab 4 or 5 films, not your own, but other people's, to save on the Ark for posterity, what would you grab? Too tough?
Quick, another answer.
Another question?
Yeah.
Oh,
another. You've
2 films.
Thrown me. Two films.
Yeah.
2 films. 2 films. Grand Illusion of Renoir.
Yeah.
And something else.
Who directed The Grand Illusion?
Jean Renoir.
So every time a French name comes up in this episode, I'm going to go silent and let you fill in the blanks. The film was Grand Illusion was written by who, Molly?
Jean Renoir and Charles Spock.
Yes, that's French they're speaking. And no, these children aren't French. They're American. And they've acquired their amazing new language skills from Muzzy.
It was released June 8th, 1937 in France. We don't know the budget, but it made on U.S. re-release about $500,000. So misfit French POWs try to escape various German war camps during the First World War.
Class relationships are explored among French prisoners in a German POW camp during World War I as they all plot to escape.
Yeah, so you nailed it right there, right? Like this film does not bother at all to hide its feelings about class, war, station in life, culture.
Nope.
It's a deeply humanist film. Every side, including the fascists, including the Germans, are shown with some degree of dignity, some degree of humanity. We're seeing sort of the individual human spirit versus like the collective absurdity of war and class. This is a much like saying all of that makes it sound very like textbook and because it's old and all this sort of stuff. It's a very funny movie.
It really is.
It is. It's labeled as a drama, and it is a drama, but I would say it is a modern equivalent. Like you can definitely see things like a little bit like The Great Escape is in here. Or rather this is in The Great Escape. I think there's a lot of Shawshank Redemption. I think there's a lot of this that's in Shawshank where we get to know all of these eclectic personalities through this long stretch of time. And through during this big event, and rather than it being a personal event, it's a European historical event. It's really about the rise of fascism in World War II, but it's set in World War One. But none of that is subtext. No. All of that is just text. And it's witty. It's funny. And yeah, I think if you were to a modern watcher who's never seen this were to turn it on, I think they'd be surprised at just how fucking funny this movie is.
It really is. And I was kind of surprised because the first time I tried watching it, I was a teenager. And at first I bemoaned the fact that there was no Criterion channel at the time. And I was collecting Criterion since I was 16. So more than half my life, you can believe that. My first one was probably Rashomon. Second one was La Belle et la Bête because it was Guillermo del Toro that got me into it because he brought up that film for Pan's Labyrinth audio commentary. And I was like, I need to watch this movie because I already loved the Disney version, 1991, Beauty and the Beast. And I was like, I got to watch this. So I rented it and I watched it. And because I was lucky enough to have at the time a video store that was an independent store. So I actually there was a Criterion selection there. I was one of the lucky few who had that. And so I watched it and I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. And it's probably the film I've watched. La Belle et la Bête is probably the one I've watched the most. And I was like, if that was in the top 5, it's number 6. It's one off on the spine.
It is.
That would be number 1 for me, for my ranking. But when I finally found a copy I could borrow and I watched it. I'm a teenager. I'm like 18, 19 years old and I'm watching it. And I actually fell asleep the first time I watched it. And I'm just, no, I committed the cardinal sin of falling asleep during a great movie. I'm going to admit that. People should be willing to admit that, especially.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Please admit it. I fell asleep during Eraserhead the time. I was so exhausted after a long day of work. And my brother comes in when he's cutting up with a baby. He's like, what the fuck is this? Baby.
That's the best. That's the only appropriate reaction to Eraserhead is what the fuck is this?
I know, just coming in to get me for dinner, just like what? But yeah, so but I rewatched it, and I end up loving it. I don't love it as much as Rules of the Game, which I think is Jean Renoir's best film because I think it is more cynical towards the aristocracy, but there is this level of humanism that I love with this film, like you mentioned. When they're discussing Eric von Stroheim's character with the French aristocrat bringing up just like our roles will be meaningless after this. And he said, yeah, And they don't really feel so sad about it, not as much as you would think, which is I was just refreshing with that, especially since Jean Renoir, he grew up in a very privileged background. He's the son of Pierre Renoir, the painter. So he already was a rich kid growing up, and he was seeing all this and being like, oh, would this be really upsetting if I lost all these privileges just because of how I was born? Maybe not. So it is kind of autobiographical in a sense. I mean, Jean Gabin even wears his World War One uniform. Jean Renoir's World War One uniform he wore when he was in the war. So yeah,
wow,
yes.
I didn't realize that. Wow.
So yeah, you're watching that, just like you could see these characters and how they get connect to each other. And I see a lot of influence with it with Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, which I saw a couple months ago with David Bowie. I brought it up, and Ryuichi Sakamoto, and I brought that up on my Twitter account and bringing up that they're humanized on both sides with the British POWs and the Japanese imperialist army. Even though there's a gay love, there's a homosexual tension, which is probably what the movie's most famous for. But yes, there's a lot of that in that movie. But I could see the influence of The Grand Illusion in a film like that, showing that humanism on both sides. I mean, even The Sound of Music was influenced by it, because there's the scene right near the end in this movie. They took basically from Le Grand Illusion, and with La Marseille, where they're singing the La Marseille scene, Casablanca took that as well.
Oh yes, 100%, 100%. Casablanca took it, 100%. Yeah, I think so. It's like when I say this movie wears its heart on its sleeve, it really does, because rather than it being subtext, I mean, you have a conversation between two aristocrats, a French aristocrat and a German aristocrat, who are now officers for their respective countries. And they're sitting there and they're sort of like lamenting, kind of, at least the German one is. And it's like, oh, the world's changing. And now we've got like sort of like nouveau riche Jewish immigrants are now buying all this property, and the Rosenthal character and all this sort of stuff. It's like, isn't that kind of sad? And then the response is, well, aristocracy is superfluous. And that is the line. I'm like, well, there's let's read between the lines. And what do you think this movie thinks about aristocracy? It's like, aristocracy is superfluous and war is arbitrary. And what the movie is a little slightly more subtle about is war, because it's like any war fought with these kind of formalities could just as easily not be fought at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's like, well, we've brought you to this camp, and we're going to hand you this guidebook, and this is how we're going to treat you at this camp, and you're going to be under these rules, and and then you watch it, and it's sort of like, it's so arbitrary. It's so very obvious that these borders and these policies and these formalities and this sort of the rules of engagement are so ludicrous and so made up that if you just put that amount of energy into just not fucking fighting a war, the war would be over. And there's that runs through the entire movie.
Yes.
That's the more subtle aspect of the film. The more overt aspect is obviously class, because there's a difference between the two French officers, their station, and then the people they share with, and so forth and so on. And then, of course, the movie ends on a very it's literal, but also metaphorical, where the aristocrat has to die in order for the person of lower station to reach freedom. And where do they go? They go to Switzerland. They go to a place of neutrality. And so, it brings those themes together of like, for the working person to thrive, the aristocracy must die. And for war to end, people must be neutral. And it's like, so I don't want to say the movie is obvious and make that a bad thing. It's obvious, and it's a great thing in the case of this film.
Yes, it very much is. And I guess this message was much more, people were more willing to listen to it than they were for Rules of the Game, which is much more cynical, which I found very fascinating with that. But it's interesting how kind of anti-monarchist that Jean Renoir is at points, because you would almost think he grew up in this privilege, this idea, and he would want that idea of being born into this sort of station in life. And I don't think he really ever felt that. And I think World War I fundamentally changed him in that sense. I mean, it was the first war to use gas And that mustard gas. And immediately after that war ended, they made it a war crime to use those gases because of how devastating the effects were. That's how bad they were. And so it's fascinating to look at that and look at and look at where he's coming from, an idea, because that just because I'm sure also he was, of course, when you bring up, you're seeing that all the aristocracy for the most part are also with everyone of different classes in the warfare. And it's also it's one of the few anti-war films where you don't even really see violence. You don't really see, it's mostly men talking to each other or talking to a woman in the third part of the film. That becomes kind of a romance right there. So it's one of those few anti-war films where you're just like, yeah, there's not really any violence.
It's an anti-war movie that's mostly actually like a prison escape film. Another thing that I think is lifted a little bit is the scene where Rosenthal is like a well-connected, he's a Jewish soldier fighting, his family were immigrants to France and they've become very affluent and they're allowed to receive prison mail in this POW camp. And so he's getting all of these very sort of high-end foods and cheeses and canned, anchovies and whatnot. And so they're, and he gets it in abundance. And so he shares with everybody. He gets it in and he shares with everybody, people of low station and the aristocrats. And so it's really funny because there's this juxtaposition between the one camp they're in where the German guards are in, like, they're basically in a gulag. And they're eating, like, the guy says, like, we're eating shoe soup again.
Yeah.
They're just eating, like, this broth. There's no substance to it. It's just, like, warm water.
Nope.
They look cold.
Yep.
They look fucking miserable. Cut to the prisoners, and there's candles, and they're at a table, and it's very nice and clean. And there's formality, and they're drinking wine, and they're eating cheeses, and they're having philosophical discussion. And you're watching them sort of slice the cheese, and I'm like, that's Goodfellas. That is the scene of Paulie slicing the garlic and they're cooking. And it's like, yeah. And I'm like, oh shit. Yes, of course. And then, of all the movies this week, this one actually made me cry.
Yeah. Oh,
and the where it moved me to tears. And I have no idea why. Is when Maréchal is in solitary confinement for leading them in singing La Marseillaise. And he's the one that gets thrown into solitary confinement for an inhumane amount of time. And he's cracking up. He's losing his shit. And he's like, I haven't heard French and I haven't seen another person. And I'm like, he's going nuts. And the German guard goes in and the German guard tries to comfort him. He like puts his arm around him. And he's not having it because he's like fucking crazy. And so then the German guard like is like rifling through his pockets and he starts pulling out cigarettes. Like, like, here, have my cigarettes to try to like calm him down. And he was not having it. And then he pulls out his harmonica. And the subtlety, because the German guy doesn't say anything.
No.
And he's like, this guy's going, the French soldier, Marshall, is going in hysterics. And so he just leaves the harmonica on the bed and he gently walks out of the room and you start hearing the harmonica play. And the other German guys are like, what the hell is all this racket and da 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 da. And he just looks at him and just like shrugs. He's like, I don't know. And just like, it was like, I don't know. That whole exchange was so tender and so like the compassion and the, it just gets to the absurdity of war, which is like people we all share common humanity. What the fuck are we fighting for? Why are we killing each other?
Especially World War I, that war was superfluous. It probably was that, and maybe the Vietnam War are the wars that we had no business being a part of. Anyone had business being a part of in the 20th century. I'm not counting the 100 Years' War, which I don't think was worth it. Neither was the 7 Years' War, but I'm talking about the 21st century. Let's not get there. There was a lot of trying to land grab from either the church or Christianity or aristocracy wanting to get more land, which is why I consider a lot of those wars very superfluous. But I'm talking about wars with 20th to 21st century wars.
Yeah, kind of modern nation state wars.
Yeah, exactly. And I really love that you brought up the Jewish man actually sharing it, because this was during a time when, because the film in intertext, they bring up where these locations are, and you realize that, oh, these are locations they were in 1916, if you do a bit more research. So when they're saying that, oh, the war should be over soon, really quickly in a couple months, it takes about 2 years, because it's 1918 the war officially ends. So that's the dramatic irony going in there. And during this time, the Dreyfus Affair was also happening in the early 19th century. So I'm sure that was kind of a thought process being in. I'm sure Jean Renoir remembered that with that, and seeing that Jewish man actually portraying that. And that was very sweet, because I think there was still a lot of anti-Semitic, especially with the oncoming rise of fascism in Germany.
Oh,
there
100%.
There was the anti-Semitic feelings going around in European nations. So, so that was fair.
Yeah, and this is an anti-Nazi film.
It really is. It really is.
That is made during the rise of Nazism and the expansion of Nazism throughout Europe, and anti-Semitism and German expansion, and we're heading towards the Second World War. And it's obviously going to get much worse. But you know, the die has already been cast, and so it's like he's using the First World War to really comment on the Second World War. In the same way, you know, it's very Shakespearean in that way. It's like as old as time. So this is a fantastic film. It is way funnier than you would think. And in fact, my overall impression, because it's really interesting, you know, you watch these movies in isolation, and you watch them together and you think, okay, why were these, other than obviously like, what could they get the license for and all this sort of stuff? But why are these the first 5 films in the Criterion Collection? And then when you look at almost all of them to a T, they're way more comedic than you would think if you were just to say without looking at the titles. What do you think the first 5 films in the Criterion Collection were? You wouldn't think that they would, and even if you gave some of the names, even like Hitchcock, which we're going to get to here in a second, you wouldn't think, well, you know, it's Hitchcock's funniest. It's you know, they're all funny movies, and so to some extent, and you're like, you wouldn't think that that they're all either comedy or slash comedy. So this movie is great. I think everybody should watch it. It's a 9.25 out of 10 for me. It's only my number 3 for this week.
It's actually not my number 1 either. So once we get to that I would rate it probably about a 9 out of 10 honestly. So but that's just me, which is still masterpiece level. So I'm sure there's going to be people like, only 9, and you just like
Where does that fall for you then? Is that like your number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5?
That is actually my number 4 on my list.
Wow. Okay. All right. Wow.
I only really connected with it later in life, in my short life. Still, I'm still pretty young, so. But yeah, I didn't connect to it as a teenager like I did these other films when I was a teen. So I think that's why in ones I was just like, I kept, and I've only seen it twice. I've seen the other ones more than twice. So that's also why I'm just biased.
Once you're elderly like me, then you'll start crying.
I probably will enjoy it more. I had that with Jean Dielman at the first I watched it when I was a teen, I was like, I am so bored. I don't like this. And then when I'm 20s, I'm like, oh my God, this movie's great. And then I watch it in my 30s, and when I'm 30, and I'm like, this is a masterpiece and one of the best movies ever made. And it's one of my comfort films now, which people are like, how can you watch 3 hours of that woman just doing chores? I'm like, it's mesmerizing, and it's quite, the minute she makes a mistake, you're like, oh my god, it's like a plot twist.
Here's what I recommend all the binge lords listening at home: get your official Binge Movies notebook that's available at bingemovies.threadless.com. Open it up, and every time Molly name drops another classic part of cinema, write that name down and go watch it. Speaking of another 3-hour movie, the longest, most epic film on our list, and probably the most influential film, arguably, of all time. Certainly the most influential filmmaker of all time. 1954's Akira Kurosawa classic, Seven Samurai, which currently has a 100%.
Ooh, as long as Armin White does not mess that up.
So I didn't really experience foreign films until I found my way into film school. And at that point is when I was actually exposed to Kurosawa. And a friend of mine, John Milius, actually was a huge fan of Kurosawa's. And so whenever the film was showing, he'd say, "Oh, you got to come and see this. You got to come and see this." And after the first one, the first one I saw was Seven Samurai. And after that, I was completely hooked. I said, this is really good. It's hard to really appreciate the true genius of Kurosawa, I think, until you've seen a few of the films and then you've been able to see other films at the same time and be able to realize his visual style. My favorite of all time is really Seven Samurai.
Seven Samurai was directed by the late, great Akira Kurosawa. It was written by Akira Kurosawa, Shinobu Hashimoto, Hideo Oguni. This film was released April 26, 1954, on a budget of 210 million yen, which was roughly at that time $580,000. It made 268.2 million yen, which is roughly $2.3 million US. That's primarily from the rentals. And it made 833,000 in the US. So a smash success. A peasant village hires a weary samurai to defend them against vicious bandits.
My sentence is basically the same, but just 7 samurai are hired, even though that's technically not accurate with the 7 samurai part. We're going into spoiler territory here. 7 samurai are hired by a poor village to defend their crops from roving bandits in the Warring States period in Japan.
This movie, though, the hard to synopsize this film is very difficult because when you give it a one-sentence plot synopsis, it sounds like 50 million other movies. The problem with that, though, especially for this film, is those 50 million other movies are aping directly from Seven Samurai. Yes, they are. Within film history, this is considered the first men on a mission movie. It's the first ragtag group movie. It's the first suicide mission movie. It's like if you've ever seen a movie from either Saving Private Ryan to Aliens to
A Bug's Life
to pretty much anything else that you've ever enjoyed, it is Seven Samurai. And if it's not Seven Samurai, it's Yojimbo. And if it's not Yojimbo, it's Hidden Fortress. There's 3 movies that were made by Akira Kurosawa in all of Western cinema, and all actually from spaghetti westerns, which is basically Yojimbo, which then made the revisionist westerns of the US, and all the way through. Like everything that you love about movies comes from Akira Kurosawa.
It certainly does. In fact, if you see so much from Spielberg and George Lucas, you're like, oh, that's where they get it from. If you watch a ton of Kurosawa's films, like you can see that with Ron and Saving Private Ryan, the storming of the beach of Normandy. It's taken directly from Ron, including the guy holding his decapitated arm up. That comes directly from Ron. Yeah. Ron, and of course, Hidden Fortress takes so much. Star Wars takes so much from Hidden Fortress.
So much.
Yes, and Seven Samurai. In fact, even the slightest touches, like Yoda just rubbing his head in Attack of the Clones, that is taken from Takashi Shimura touching his bald head when he cut it to save that child, which was in that film an act of dishonor as well, because samurais, they're top knots, they worship their top knots. It was a sign of their nobility and their privilege in that society, and he's basically shunning his aristocratic signifier to protect a helpless child, which is why he's the samurai they go to, the first one that actually they know that he may actually help us.
Well, yeah, so that's like, okay, let's get beyond all of the, basically, if you've ever seen a Western or a war movie or an action movie after 1954, it's Seven Samurai. Yeah. And that's why, that's when those movies actually start to get good, because otherwise you got a bunch of John Wayne bullshit. But this is also a movie about class because it's what might be missing upon us as Western audience members is the idea of these samurai sort of pledging themselves to help poor villagers is all about it's an unusual arrangement, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
It's a transgressive arrangement. And the fact that some of these samurai we got one in particular, which is this is the triumphant debut of Toshiro Mifune for Binge Movies. So put that in your Binge Movies notebook. Yes. Him playing, oh my gosh.
Kyozo?
Kyo.
Yeah.
So, yeah. He's sort of this sort of pretender samurai in essence. And then, when all these other ones are they're kind of mostly Ronins, they're sort of disgraced samurai.
Yeah, they don't really have they don't have a master, and they're trying to find a lord, a daimyo to be hired for.
And instead, they cross this line, this cultural line, for the sake of their principles, for the sake of nobility, not nobility of like station, but nobility of virtue, of ethic, and decide to help these people. And if you've ever seen a movie where you have this sort of dignified, world-weary, but yet dignified, morally upright leader who has to make very tough decisions, it's somebody is doing Shimura from this film. I mean, like you watch this movie, and the movie is 3+ hours long and or right around there. It's very long, but my opinion, the second hour is the strongest hour of the movie. I love that second hour, which is like really comes alive. But his ability, Kurosawa's ability in this film, that it's not just like this one's so hard to talk about, Molly. It's not just that each samurai has a distinct personality, but a lot of the villagers do too.
Yes.
And it's like these are very, very well drawn characters, and they're all distinct from each other, and you end up feeling for having some kind of emotion, whether it's disgust or pity or empathy or sympathy or a sense of admiration for the heroism of some of these characters. You feel like it's a long ass movie, but the entire time you feel for these characters. That's so important because if you don't know anything about Seven Samurai, and if you've ever seen a movie past 1954, you do know Seven Samurai. It doesn't end well for a lot of these characters.
No, it does not. No, it does not.
And so heart-wrenching
it is
to watch the death of these characters. And maybe my favorite scene in the movie is when Mifune comes back with all of this samurai armor. And he's doing it he's so desperate for like the fatherly approval of these true, once great and noble samurai, because he is this self-made, self-aggrandizing kind of, he's a poser, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, which he is, which they bring up in a really funny scene where they have the scroll and he can't read. So he can read names, but he can't really read days of birth. So they have the scroll where he says, "That's my family tree right there." Just like, "Oh, you look great for a 14-year-old boy," because he couldn't read.
Right.
So that's how he got his name, because we don't really know his real name. He just took it from that scroll right there, and he's like, "We're just going to keep calling you Kyo." So
and when he screams a lot in this movie,
he really does, but he has good reason to.
And when he's going off, because he's like, they're like disgusted by it, because what that means is, essentially these villagers and him, they killed these other samurai who were fleeing battle and stole their armor off their dead bodies. So it's like dishonor, disgrace, basically sacrilege.
Exactly. But it also brings up just like You want to know why they hire? You want to know why? Because you're no better than the bandits. Because they bring that up with the daughter having her hair cut to pretend to be a boy so she won't be raped. Because samurai, they feel the people are property. They're objects for them to be used for, which is why they hide a bunch of that, because they know that the samurai will starve them, and they know that, and that's how desperate they are. And it's also, this is kind of autobiographical as well, if you think about it, because Kurosawa did come from a samurai lineage. So this was his apology almost for everything his family did, because he knows with there was record keeping of his family line, and he knew that many of his ancestors, they were rapists. They did kill indiscriminately peasantry because they just saw them as nobodies. They saw them as people not worth caring about because they only were meant to serve the samurai or the daimyo. They weren't meant to have their own lives and their own looks, and that's their own world beyond this class structure. And Kurosawa also humanizes the bandits, especially with the one played by Yoshio Tsuchiya, who people may remember from Godzilla films as well. He was in a lot of Godzilla films, and he's also in a lot of Kurosawa films. And Funeral Parade of Roses, he's the dad in Funeral Parade of Roses. Spoiler alert right there, which is how Kurosawa actually cast Pita in Ron, the drag queen actor. So fun fact. So that's how they got connected. But yeah, as Rikichi, whose wife was stolen by the bandits. So,
yes. Yeah. This is another, it's a little revisionist history, sort of. It's like a fantasy, because it's like, we have the situation where the young maiden is sort of like to the matinee idol samurai is like, why don't you like do your duty, do what a samurai does? And he like refuses in the field, and he's just like, yeah. And then it ends up sort of becoming a legitimate romance. And then when they figure out that there's this widow woman who's in the village who's starving to death, they give up their rice, and then they end up feeding the kids. And so it's like, it's almost like a revisionist history of like, what if samurais weren't pieces of shit?
It really is. This is why I think a lot of Japanese audiences were like, this feels more like a Western than it really does a film like that, because we didn't really see, because samurais were always portrayed for the most part before this film as very heroic. It was all black and white. There was no shades of gray in there. And Kurosawa broke that mold. And especially, it almost seems like he was breaking it because he did a lot of World War II propaganda films where he did like, the Sangato character who was kind of this propaganda figure for the imperialist army that became a meme with the Dreamcast. I think it was that he became a character trying to sell a video game thing. So fun fact. But yes, a Kurosawa character ended up peddling Sega Dreamcast. Yes, Sangato. So that was a part of that. And I think it was almost kind of Kurosawa's apology for making those kinds of films in World War II, because having to, and you could see that also with Stray Dogs, the previous film, with that post World War II, and realizing that it was not worth it trying to recreate this idea of Japanese Sengoku period or Japanese Warring States eras with daimyos, because they were worshiping Tojo and those generals as daimyos, basically, not emperors at that time, and they were trying to recreate that idealized version of the samurai with it, which is why they also in World War II they did commit seppuku a bunch of times, and the kamikaze was all about that, which is like the honorable death right there.
Yeah, so this movie is subverting all of that, because the honorable death is not to die for the state. The honorable death is to die for the poor and the marginalized. The honorable death is to self-sacrifice for the benefit of others, for the salvation of others. But the thing is, like, going back to Mifune's rant, the main one with the samurai armor, is what we get to the basis of his rage, which is he was orphaned very, very young. And there's obviously the scene
with
with
the
him. And he's
babies.
like, this is exactly what happened to me.
Baby from the fire after the mom's sacrifice to save that child. I cried
Yes.
during that scene. That's my scene where I cried
Yeah.
and realizing that this child will not
Yeah.
have any family. And yes, and that's what
Exactly.
Mhm.
It's the cycle's
Basically, yeah.
repeating itself. But the reason why he hates these farmers so much is because essentially
No.
none of them
Mm-mm.
adopted him. None of them took him in. After he was
No.
orphaned, nobody gave a shit about him. And so he's like, these are greedy people. They're misers. They hide things. They they pretend to be poor. They pretend they don't have anything, but it's really so they can exploit others, and they're playing you basically. And then he also hates the samurai because
because they led them to that.
and he's like, you blame them for being murderers. Well, who trained them to be murderers? You did. You made them into murder. So you realize this is a man without a country. This is a man who is angry at everybody because as a child nobody rescued him, right?
No.
And so, he has, there are no real main characters. Everybody is kind of a main character,
Basically,
or at least 3 or 4. But he gets a big character arc. He gets that goes from being that angry, broken young man into being somebody who makes decisions that give him the nobility and credibility. And what's so perfect about that scene, just like Grand Illusion, is at a certain point, they stop the samurai, stop arguing with him, and they're just listening. And then you look at Shimura's face, and his eyes are flooded with tears. And then there's just a long fucking pause because eventually Mifune just breaks down and is just sobbing on the floor like a child.
Yes, he is.
This big, hulking, strong, angry young man is just like sobbing like a child.
I know.
And it's such a subtle moment, but Mifune's hands go, he's like in the sitting cross-legged, and you watch his hands, and his hands go slowly, they go slack, right? He goes from having almost like fists as this guy's yelling at him, and then as he starts sobbing, his hands just open up and they go slack. And his eyes are flooded with tears. His whole posture changes, even though he's in the same position. And then he says, like, you were a orphan of farmers, He says it with so much compassion.
Yes.
And the embarrassment, the shame, the pain washes over Mifune's face, and he runs out. And you realize, like, the basis of all of this guy's anger and bravado and all this sort of stuff is pain, just trauma, really.
It really is.
And from that, it's like the idea that these samurai show him compassion and to a certain extent kind of allow him to save face a little bit. Yeah. And it's just beautiful. That's
it is beautiful.
This movie's so hard to talk about because we could do 3 hours just on this.
I know, you really could. I mean, we haven't even discussed the homoerotic tension.
Nope.
No, it's just like, especially because historically a lot of samurai did engage in sexual relationships with their apprentices. Which makes perfect sense. And I realize I've been Kikuchiyo, not Kyozo. Kikuchiyo was
Kikuchiyo. That's it. Yeah, Kikuchiyo.
Yes. Kyozo is the skilled one, the one that the youngest apprentice has the crush on, but he also has the crush on the girl who had her hair cut and is dressed as a man. So, and the first time they meet, he's picking flowers, which is not a masculine
very good point
trait. And he's just like, young boy should not be picking up flowers, pointing the flowers right at her. And then he just like puts it back, and then they have their scene in the flower beds. So it's like, and then you see him catching him looking at Kyozo many times, and just like this fondest admiration. And he screams the loudest when Kyozo is shot in the finale, and he sacrifices basically himself to throw his katana to point where the shooter is, right there. And you're like, oh wow.
Is the reason why he doesn't take advantage of the young girl in the flower bed? Is it really revisionist history to give some sort of honor to samurai, or is it because potentially he's more attracted to men?
I think it might be a mix of both, but also because he does believe this idea of honorable samurai because he's so young and he hasn't had that experience where, oh, most samurai do not act like that. Most samurai are not, they put a facade of honor. So he's trying to live up to that honor. Yeah. Honor that doesn't really exist.
He's an idealist.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. He's basically like what like with Harakiri, with where he's like the samurai, the main samurai before what's his name? The guy who was in Kagemusha, but that guy, and Yojimbo, of course.
Yeah.
And so he's like the pre-thing before his son-in-law is killed and his daughter dies, and so he's like screw honor, and he's like the pre-version of that where he hasn't had his rose-colored glasses are not off yet. So,
man, I could keep talking about it forever, but we can't because we have to eventually end this episode.
Yeah, unfortunately.
I very rarely do this. This is, I don't know, 4th time maybe in the history of the show that I've done this. Mm-hmm. This movie to me is a 10 out of 10. Same.
It's a 10 out of 10. It's my number one on the rankings.
Yeah, same. Yeah. Absolutely. And here's the thing, right? Mm-hmm. There's so much discourse now, about how long movies should be and all this sort of stuff. And I subscribe to the Ebert, like no good movie is too long and no bad movie is too short.
Exactly. If you've got the DVD like I did when I was a teenager, then it would end and you're like, insert disc 2, and you're like, no pause, keep going.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
First of all, this movie is so energetically filmed. Mm-hmm. The cinematography is incredible.
Yes.
You'll recognize so much of everything you love about cinema, including all the wipes and everything that will eventually get picked up by Star Wars. Mm-hmm. And you'll pick it all up. And not to go very low art since we're doing a Criterion Collection deal here, but I have been begging somebody for the love of God, since we are so adrift creatively. Mm-hmm. Why in the fuck doesn't somebody make just Magnificent Seven Samurai with fucking Jedi? Why doesn't set it wherever? Set it in the Old Republic. I don't give a shit. Mm-hmm. Cast Ken Watanabe as the head fucking Jedi.
I'd be really fine with that.
The Jedi are stolen samurai. They're stolen. Everything about them is Japanese. Stolen valor. We have a douchebag right here. Just fucking be like, here's some Jedi that are on a suicide mission to protect a village against whoever, Imperial forces. Well, I don't care when, but against some sort of imposing threat, and it fucking writes itself.
It really does.
The scene where I don't even remember which samurai it is. It might be Kanbai, but where he's practicing sword play in the middle of the pouring rain when everybody else is inside. He's focusing on his craft. I mean, goddamn, just lift that scene, make it a fucking lightsaber. Let's get back to Jedi's being worth the shit. And you could also use it just in the same way that Akira Kurosawa was trying to do a revisionist history. We're at the point where we need revisionist history to where because Jedi fall by the dozen into the dark side at this point. And there's 50 million of them and they're all evil now. And so can we just have a revisionist Star Wars movie where we see Jedi actually be noble and actually be peacekeepers in the universe, in the galaxy?
I could see that in the High Republic. They're already writing books in the High Republic where it was over 1,000 years before the original series. Do it in that time period, please.
Yes.
That would be fantastic.
Exactly. Show us some Jedi who actually seem human and actually
I know.
Have some integrity, for God's sakes. Leave the deconstruction to other things, but that's neither here nor there. Okay. So, this is my number one. It's a 10 out of 10. I went on a Star Wars rant off of Akira Kurosawa, but it's not that far off because Star Wars basically is Akira Kurosawa. So,
basically, yes.
Yeah, we both love this. And here's my argument. Okay. If you think the movie's too long, the movie has natural breaks in it. So treat it as if it's a fucking mini series. It has a very
Mm-hmm.
has an intermission, but watch it about an hour at a time, because there's after about an hour, then there's like it fades to black, and you could just stop it and then come back to it. You won't want to if you actually give it a chance, but if your attention span is so broken, divide it up into basically an hour, an hour, and an hour and a half, and it'll be one of the best miniseries you ever watch. Just treat it as a limited series. And watch it, and you'll realize, oh my God, it's fucking awesome. And I can't wait for the day where this is divided into 300 parts across TikTok.
Oh, I would. Oh, yes. Let's get into that once it's in the public domain. So even though Criterion Collection would be like, if they ask, because it's owned by distribution rights are owned by Yanis Films. And I'm sure if TikTok asked for it, they like, no, fuck you. Like with like William Friedkin stuff. No, fuck you. They asked.
Fuck you, yes.
So, yeah.
I don't give a flying fuck into a rolling donut.
And they're like, we don't even pay residuals for this movie, but no, F you.
Let's move on to another comedy. 1938's The Lady Vanishes, which currently has a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes.
When The Lady Vanishes was released, Alfred Hitchcock was the most famous and successful director in England, and he was very much on Hollywood's radar. Producer David O. Selznick admired Hitchcock's work, and he'd been toying with the idea of signing him to a contract, bringing him to America. But Hitchcock's last few films had not done particularly well at the box office, and Selznick was having second thoughts. Those second thoughts, however, quickly receded once The Lady Vanishes was released. It immediately became England's most successful movie to date. Margaret Lockwood was undeniably part of that success. Audiences were taken with her, as was Alfred Hitchcock. He told the press that the British picture industry had the possibility of developing a star of unanticipated possibilities, adding that Lockwood had, quote, an undoubted gift in expressing her beauty in terms of emotion and an extraordinary insight in getting the feel of her lines.
The Lady Vanishes was directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It was written by Frank Laudner and Sidney Galat. It is based on The Wheel Spins, which is a 1936 novel by Ethel Lena White. International espionage on a train serves as the ultimate thrill ride meet cute.
My sentence is, an English tourist traveling on a train is horrified to discover that an elderly passenger she befriended has disappeared, and everyone on the train denies having ever seen this passenger.
Isn't this entire movie just basically a protracted rom-com meet cute?
Basically, yes.
It's not a romance.
It really
It's like what if you had a big long meet cute, but it was the meet cute was two random people during an Agatha Christie novel ran into each other.
Basically, yes.
And I was so surprised at a couple of different things. How funny the movie is. I've never seen this one before, ironically. How horny this movie is. Is that the horniest? Definitely. It's not the horniest, but it's really fucking horny.
Yeah, it is. It's not the horniest Alfred Hitchcock's ever done, but really, really, really horny.
And how raunchy it is.
It really is. Just that pre-code cinema is just, I love it so much. And also the one that has the gay couple in the bed, and they just chop out one of them shirtless, just like, oh my God, just the two guys just right there, just hopping out of bed. And they're just right there providing commentary, which is great.
It's okay. So the first 30 minutes of this movie, and it's probably not actually 30 minutes, but it feels like the first 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, okay, we have these two British travelers, and they're sort of these stuffy, stiff upper lip sort of Brits, these sort of prissy Brits. And it's very much like a C-3PO R2-D2, keeping with the Star Wars theme kind of relationship. And it's very much like, it's definitely playing around with the idea of, even if they themselves are not gay, which I think they are, but even if they aren't.
Yes, they are.
Everybody else thinks they are, right?
Yeah.
So,
Hitchcock is not, if you talk to him, he's like, he would even say, no, I cast Anthony Perkins in Psycho because he was gay. And that also brought in that demure, that disposition of very tight knit and hiding something. And he was very much, and Roper was also gay as well, which is why we had, I remember there was
very
that
much so.
with the screenwriters when he heard that James Stewart was cast, like, just like, this guy is supposed to have had sex with these two boys. Just like, Jimmy Stewart has no sex. This guy, and you're like, wow.
They're kind of gay panic jokes a little bit, but not really, because these fake Balkan states that they create for the movie.
Yes.
And this like little inn, this bed and breakfast inn sort of, I don't know, hostile sort of situation that they're in, it's like they have a very European sensibility about it. So like the maid that doesn't speak English and they speak some sort of, it's almost Italian, but not. It's kind of this made up language. She's just very like, oh yeah, okay, all right, two men are going to share. That's fine. Yeah, okay. Just let me get my hat. You know, you're convinced, like having never seen this movie before. I'm like, these have got to be our main characters, and these two guys are going to kind of fumble fuck their way through this murder mystery, this lady vanishing. And I got to be honest with you, the scene where they're sitting there and they're talking to the lady, Foy, Miss Foy.
Yeah,
right?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Foy?
Oh yeah, Miss Froy.
Froy. When she's talking to them and she's like, oh, I think this is a magical place, and it's almost as if the big mountains are singing the little mountains of the chorus.
Yes.
I was literally like rolling my fucking eyes, and I was like, I cannot believe this.
Yes.
I hate this. This is so just tacky, whatever. Then cut to their reaction, and they have the exact same fucking reaction as I do. And then I realize, oh, she is supposed to be this sort of, she's coming off as this idiotic sort of character, and it's intentional. It's not just bad acting or a poorly written monologue. She is supposed to be daffy. And when they're just like, oh my, yeah, can you believe this bullshit this lady said? I was like, oh my God. And then I got it. I was like, okay, I'm in for this. I love it. And then we switch characters. We switch characters to this bachelorette who is very much of like this era, like of sort of the single women doing it for themselves who may or may not be lesbians. One of our contributing hosts here at Binge Movies has a theory that most people's grandmas were actually lesbians.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think my great aunt was. My mom seems to think she was. Yeah. And I was like, oh, it's a good thing I'm named after her then, because I'm pretty gay myself.
and I like definitely the one friend definitely seems the tallest one. Because there's three of them. The one friend definitely feels like, oh, this. And maybe both the other two were supposed to, but it's definitely like that one is like, oh yeah, this is her and her lesbian friends, you know.
Yes. Basically, yes. It's their sewing circle right there.
Sewing circle. Yes, they're roommates. And they were roommates, and they were traveling around the world, having all these adventures and like running with the bulls in Spain, and basically just sort of I assume they come from money, and they're just sort of traveling the world and having these high adventures, and now it's time for the social custom of, well, and now I've got to a certain age and I'm expected to get married.
Yep.
I got to marry this drip, and I got to conform. And then meanwhile, there is this troubadour asshole, artsy whack job prick upstairs. Who the entire time I was like, is that Gary Oldman? Is that a young Gary Oldman?
Michael Redgrave, who is Vanessa Redgrave's dad.
Yeah, correct. And it's like, okay, this is obviously our meet cute because they don't like each other, and then they actually hate each other, and then they're gonna, he's an asshole, and and eventually she's gonna fall for him, and we'll figure out he's not really an asshole, and all that happens. But then we finally get on the train. We kind of forget about the two British guys. And then turns out Miss Froy is involved in some kind of subterfuge and just goes missing. And everybody on the train denies this woman even ever existed.
Yep. So basically she's being gaslit for a lot of the film.
Yeah, correct. She's being gassed up by all these people in the train, and she's got at some point she gets bonked on the head, and she has tea with Miss Froy, and she passes out. When she wakes up, the concierge of the train is basically like, well, you ordered tea, but you only had tea for yourself. You know, you were sitting alone, and all the typical mystery stuff. Yeah. I like this movie all the way up until about the third act, and then the third act kind of loses me a little bit until the shootout. Because when the shootout is happening, when she's our main character is like, Gilbert. That's not supposed to be funny.
I think it kind of really is, because it was during that scene where he gets shot.
You think so?
He gets shot. One of the guys gets shot. He's like, oh, yes. She thinks
she thinks
like,
he's dead.
Pocket square for my wound right here. Just like that British stuffiness going in. I was laughing during that scene.
Oh well, the dude who waves the white flag,
yes,
and gets killed. When he has a line, he's like, "You idiots!" He's like, he says something like, "Just because I have the common sense not to want to die, all of a sudden I'm being labeled as a pacifist," or something like that. And it's the line is funny, but his delivery is funnier. And then it's extra funny when he goes out the door to wave the white flag, just immediately killed. And the more like actiony sort of like, we got to stop the train, the more thriller aspect of that kind of loses me for a little while. But then when it kickbacks into the shootout, it's pretty good. And then I think the movie suffers from the thing that a lot of movies from this era suffer with. It's just a different sensibility from a different era of filmmaking, which is movies just ended. They didn't have endings.
And it's not the first time Alfred Hitchcock had that. I mean, The Birds is probably the most extreme example right there. So yeah, it's the same thing with.
He kind of did that for the rest of his career.
With 39 Steps, just kind of ends. I was like, well, what? It's the ending? And I think Foreign Correspondent, I had that exact feeling. I was like, it's over? What's going on here?
So overall, I really like this movie. I'm trying not to spoil it as much as I can, because I would like people to see it. But for me, I give it a 9 out of 10. It's my number 4 for the week. I want to know your thoughts on it, though.
I give it an 8.5, and it's actually my number 5 on the list. So it's
This is when you like the least, huh?
But I do love it. It's in my top 5 Hitchcocks. So that's saying a lot that it's my 5 on the list. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, the first time I watched it on a bootleg DVD that was really badly restored. And even then I was like, oh, this movie's great, even though it looks terrible. It's just, and then when I got the Criterion version, I was like, oh, it's just like, it's like watching a whole different film. And it's just so funny to watch. And one thing I also wanted to bring up with hilarity is that Michael Redgrave was pretty openly bisexual. So Alfred Hitchcock may have done that wink and nod about adding the homoerotic comedy with Michael in the film, because it was and his whole family apparently knew that. It's just like, yeah, we know he has a fez with other men. It just happens. You were just British. We don't really talk about it though.
Right.
So, that British stuff lit right there. Like,
there's no movie on this list that's like, this is junk. There's one I don't like at all, and we'll get to it eventually. But
yeah. Oh, okay. But I will say that, hey, for people who don't like a lot of really long films, it's only 1 hour and 37 minutes. So
yeah, and it moves pretty quick too. It's a very, very short film. A movie that's not short is 1973's the most modern movie on our list, Amarcord, which currently has an 88% Rotten Tomatoes.
Federico Fellini, who's won more Oscars for his foreign films than any other director, presents his newest, funniest, most wonderful movie, Amarcord. Instantly one of the 10 best movies of the year, Fellini is the director that I admire above all others, says Gene Shalit of The Today Show. Amarcord is hilarious and the most beautiful movie Fellini has ever made, says Newsweek magazine. Amarcord, it means I remember. You'll remember. Amarcord, from New World Pictures, rated R.
Amarcord was directed by Federico Fellini, is written by Federico Fellini and Tonino Guerra, was released December 18th, 1973 in Italy, made $2.3 million. Living is the greatest act of masturbation.
It truly is. It truly is. My one sentence synopsis is Federico Fellini reimagines his boyhood living in Rimini, Italy through various vignettes of eccentric characters living in 1930s fascist Italy.
Is this the first fart-centric entry into the Criterion Collection? It has to be, right? How many farts are in this movie?
There were quite a few, and I think it's the one that has the one of the ones urinating on the floor as a joke. Well, I was laughing.
Yeah.
I was like, that's super creative. Why does no boy in my high school do that? I'm like, oh, because no boy would think about that. But I was like, I wouldn't even be mad because that's just creative.
It's yes. Okay, so boy, the juxtaposition between there's multiple narrators, but there's sort of this main narrator who's waxing romantic about the great history and culture of Italy and of this region of Italy, the Rimini region, and all of the art and culture and buildings and history, and then the actual townsfolk who surround him, who are entirely lecherous, vulgar, dim-witted, and corrupt, are constantly throwing things at him, booing him, shutting him down. That's almost Monty Python-esque. I mean,
basically,
that is
yes.
Holy Grail-esque. He's going, oh, the beauty of the city. And then every time we cut to one of these vignettes, it's people fucking farting, shitting, cussing, going crazy, screaming, being mentally ill, family dysfunction.
But also, Benito Mussolini worship is going on. And the main character.
And that's also, that's part of the vulgarity and the absurdity, though, because it's a giant rose
picture
diorama or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. That's talking like fucking Zardoz. And all these kids are like fantasizing about, this talking Mussolini flower display that's going to wed them to all the women they want to fuck. And it's just almost every citizen in this movie is seen as crass and seen in the most scatological way possible. Yes. And we have all this common Italian themes of the sacred versus the profane. We've got the new whores, sex workers who arrive in a town, immediately juxtaposed between the Madonnas, and we get the transcendent and the carnal. We get the institutional corruption. We get to your point, the Mussolini worship, which breaks out into ecstatic absurdity. Yes. And then, like, what you realize when you're watching it is, well, two things. One, if you don't know what you're watching, this could be an extremely off-putting because it's very long.
Truly, yes.
It's linear in the sense that it goes from spring to spring, but everything that happens in between there is seemingly at random. It is, everything is so larger than life. What you realize is like, oh, well, this is a nostalgia piece, and nostalgia makes small details larger than life.
It really does, which is why I personally, this is one of my favorite Fellini films, which I'm sure will maybe shock some people, but it's number 2 after La Dolce Vita. In fact, I even contributed to its TV trope page when I was in undergrad. And I did. I even, what's quote I have for it, I actually wrote it in myself, where it's like, Fellini brought to maturity this conviction that in order to extract profound truth from the reality of the phenomenal world that appears before us, you must reinvent that reality. And that was by Vittorio Boriani, director of the Fellini Foundation. I just love that quote because this is that kind of movie to me. Like the scene where they're seeing that ship and they're seeing that liner. And I found out during the audio commentary that it looked too real to Fellini. So he said, no, I need it to look more cardboard-like. So they had to recreate it to make it look more fake, so that people would realize that,
which makes perfect sense.
Nostalgic memory. And there were still people that apparently that have said, I remember that liner. And you're like, that liner never came to Rimini. That was a fiction from the film. But I love those, that truer than reality itself aspect of the film. And of course, I was kind of a horny teenager myself. Like Tina Belcher is kind of my spirit animal sometimes because I was, which is kind of surprising considering I'm pretty asexual right now. But but I was just like, I don't want to be a part of it personally, but I'm fine with watching it. And I was like, yeah, I was feeling that, especially for older women. It's kind of a cliche that gay girls really like older women. And we're like, yeah, we kind of do. We kind of do. Like Sarah Paulson, I think is the queen of that with Helen Tyler. Since they're like decades apart in age. And Sarah Paulson even said, when somebody said, I love you, it's like, oh, thank you. You're way too young for me, though.
That's amazing.
And these vignettes, so, I loved how he crafts them. And I love these. Yeah.
This is an exceptionally well-crafted film, and I'm in agreement with you. I have not seen all of Fellini's work, but I've seen a handful of it, and of the handful of films, a lot of the most famous ones. I think this is my favorite of his, and I don't know why, because it's not like his most highbrow film.
No,
but it's this is arguably it's obviously his most crass movie, but there's something about it. I think it's the absurdity of it, the comedic sensibility of it. And then it's not just crass for the sake of being crass. It's adolescent because Fellini is remembering his adolescence. Yeah. So rather than make a coming of age movie, and there's another one on this list where it's like, it's a coming of age movie where it's exploring adolescence from an adult perspective, looking backwards. What he's done is he's recast the entire town that's vaguely a stand-in from where he's from, as adolescent and puerile as he was at that age, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's masturbating in cars and doing circle jerks. Everybody's horny. Everybody's got the sensibility of a hypersexed teenage weirdo.
Yes, including the adult who goes up on the tree and says, I want a woman. Yeah. I even sometimes put that in as a meme on my Twitter account when I'm feeling lonely. I'm just like, me right now, I want a woman. And I wonder how many people get that reference.
Yeah. I don't know. And then the priest who's like severely preoccupied, but with whether or not the boys in town are masturbating.
Yes.
And there's a grown man who comes up to confess his sins. And he doesn't even hear the confession. He just gives him the Hail Marys and passes him along so he can get to the next boy so he can talk about masturbation with him.
Yeah, basically you're like, oh, they did. It was kind of an open secret.
100%.
Yeah, which I think is why this film, and I know that Dolce Vita were both condemned by the Catholic Church. So Dolce Vita, my dad, it was funny. My dad was in high school when that movie came out. My dad's a boomer. And he and his friends went to this theater in Virginia, because they heard they have this film that was banned in Italy. They might have some boobies. And he went to an all-boys school, like Tito goes to mostly with all boys, where he hangs out and he has the uniform. And they go and they went there, and it's a long movie. And my dad was just like, where are the boobs? I didn't see any nipples except for the final. I almost thought I saw it, but he was just like, it's very good, but I don't understand why it was banned. It's like, oh, it's because that scene where the opening scene where Marcello Mastroianni is being a journal, obscuring his journalist integrity by trying to flirt with a sunbathing woman on that roof, and he's holding the statue of Jesus just right below him, just like, call me, like, what are your numbers? Right. So, and that was what the Catholic Church was like, no way. So in Spain, and it was Spain. So and I'm just like, it is not hard to have been banned in fascist Spain with Francisco Franco. No, it was not that hard. I don't think my dad and his friends realized.
Well, if your dad wanted boobs, he should have waited until the 70s, because Amarcord has two of the most prodigious busts.
Yes.
And one of the most protracted nipple sucking scenes.
I almost wonder how the Puritans would handle that scene. And it's and they wouldn't care that the actor that was playing Tito was in his early 20s. They wouldn't care. It's like, he's a teenager. That's sexual assault. It's just,
That's your generation. That's your generation, Molly. That's your generation. It may not be you, but that's your generation. It's like, I don't consent to watching these giant breasts come out on screen and have this guy sucking on them. Well, what's great about that is he isn't sucking on them. She's telling him to, but he's such a loser of a teenager. He's obviously like the closest thing we get to a Fellini stand-in. He is so inept. He's so horny. and yet so sexually inept, which of course is obviously like this great
It
metaphor
really
for
is.
adolescence, right? Like you talked about it yourself, and of course myself as well. You're at your hormonal horniest, arguably, and you don't know what the fuck you want or what the fuck you're doing.
Exactly. Really.
You want everything and nothing, and you don't know what to do, and you think you know, and so he finally gets this woman, you know, and she pulls her breast out, and it's just like, if you know, and all he has to do is suck a nipple, and he just keeps blowing, keeps raspberrying, no pun intended, her chest, and she's like, suck, and he's like, and it's so ludicrous. You're like, he can't, and there's obviously a metaphor too there of, you know, men cannot listen to what satisfies a woman. It's great. It's just great shit. And then she's finally just like puts her boobs away, just like, here, take a cigarette, get the fuck out of here, get out. And then it's solidified with he can't even get the door open.
Like it's cringe comedy.
She has to get her own door open.
Comedy right there.
It's 100%. It's cringe comedy. It's cringe comedy. It's also a great sexual metaphor. He can't get her door open.
Exactly.
Yeah. So is this a debaucherous, debased, you know, people are pissing, farting, you know, circle jerking, all this.
Yes, it is. But it's also beautiful, like the peacock scene, right?
But it's beautiful.
In the fountain with the peacock, and you're just like, oh. And
that's the most famous scene from the film. And it's incredible. It's the peacock in the snow is incredible. And also, I think the real interesting thing that he does with the ship, the liner, is, you know, they stay up all night long to see this grand creation of the fascist regime, you know, Viva Italia, long live the regime. Yeah. And it passes by, and they're in the darkness, and then like we like cut away from it, like we're going to cut to another scene, and then there's this real quick cut of what seems to be them trapped in the wake of the ship. And then we smash cut away from it. And I'm thinking, okay, first time I'm like, man, is this an editing error? Because it's not enough for you. And then I wrote about it and I'm like, it could be an editing error, or it could be that they've waited all this time to see the glory of the regime. And it's just sort of passing them by, not even acknowledging their presence. And then they're just almost obliterated in the wake of it. Yeah, in the darkness. They're left in the darkness. They're left at sea. They're left in the chaos of the waters. They're left in the wake of this. All of this time and money has been spent to build this cruise liner as for the glorious regime of Mussolini and fascism and the love of these people for fascism. I mean, that's not even a metaphorical. They're like, viva la fascist. Fascism.
Because then in less than 10 years late, less than a decade, we're going to have it where those same people would be like, no, I screamed and cheered when Mussolini and his mistress were on those meat hooks.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Well, the only person who's sort of anti-fascist is the idiot dad who gets up in the bell tower and is like,
and he's forced to drink the castor oil with the regime right there. And then he messes up his pants because it gives you diarrhea. It's a really sad scene.
Yes. Well, it's like, that's the other thing. Guy shits himself and then gets a bath, and his wife is weeping over him as he's being bathed. And his son is disgusted, and it's like, oh my God. And so it's like, it's what's really interesting though is it's like, obviously this is an anti-fascist movie, but also it has no problem taking down the anti-fascist. So it's sort of it's Fellini looking back and being like, every adult in my life was a fucking idiot. And I was a fucking idiot.
We're all kind of idiots that we're all just trying to exist, basically.
We're all horny idiots struggling our way through life. Where the movie loses me, ironically enough, is by the time we get to the marriage of the beauty parlor owner, the older woman who's lamenting the fact that she's unwed in her late 20s, early 30s or whatever. And she ends up marrying a member of the regime, a member of the fascist party. And then that's his fantasy woman. And so he just disappears and all this sort of shit. I don't care about that wedding. I don't care. I don't care about the end. It's odd because it's like, by the time we get there, I don't give a shit. And I think it's because I care less about the characters themselves and more about the world that he's created. And he's done such a incredible job of creating such an absurdist world. This is an odd connection to make, but if anybody's familiar with now discredited Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon days, the book that he wrote, the movie feels very much like that. It feels very like it's just a disparate group of characters, quirky characters in a town. By the time then we get into the specific of really dialing into to him and his heartbreak over this woman and her sort of settling for this fascist and all this sort of stuff, I just didn't care. So the ending loses me, but I still give it a 9.5 out of 10 because I think it's masterful filmmaking. It's actually my second of the week.
Same as mine. It's my second too, and I actually have the same rating, 9.5 out of 10.
Well, that leaves one movie for me I don't like, which is sort of surprising, but it's 1959's The 400 Blows, which currently has a 99% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Striving to depict not the dewy-eyed memory, but rather the painful, yearning experience of adolescence, Truffaut opens his film with a driving sequence through the streets of Paris in which the Eiffel Tower seems elusively out of reach, and closes it with an epochal final shot in which Antoine looks directly into the camera as if challenging the audience. In between, he offers an affectingly authentic portrayal of the tribulations of teenage years, creating a set text, the influence of which would reverberate through movies as diverse as George Lucas's 1973 hit American Graffiti and Greta Gerwig's 2017 charmer Lady Bird, of which the director said that she wanted to create a female counterpart to films like The 400 Blows.
The 400 Blows was directed by Francois Truffaut. Can you give me the French pronunciation?
Francois Truffaut.
Bonjour, je suis le grand musique.
Je suis la jeune fille.
There we go. And it was written
by himself and also co-written by, I'm like, I am an encyclopedia, but sometimes I'm like, it escapes me. And Marcel Musset.
It was released May 4th, 1959. Intentionally released on Star Wars Day, you think? Or 30.7.
Probably not. Or did Star Wars make sure to have, or did George Lucas make sure to release it on that day?
$30.7 million at the box office. Wayward French street urchin drifts away from the uncaring adult world toward a life of loneliness and petty crime.
My sentence is, Francois Truffaut crafts an autobiographical film with his author avatar, Antoine Doinel, in his troubled childhood spurred by his rebellious nature and unwillingness to comply with societal norms.
This is the directorial debut of Truffaut, and obviously he's one of the founding fathers, one of the founding people of the French New Wave. Which is also obviously had a huge influence on cinema, and would essentially give us the new Hollywood eventually.
Yes.
As a matter of filmmaking form, this is exceptionally well-made movie, especially from a debuting filmmaker.
And former film critic too, so people are just like, film critics just can't make films. You're like, Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard were both
very true
film critics, so...
Every once in a while, I like to look and see what the real critics had to say. And so I looked at what Roger Ebert had to say about this, because he wrote multiple pieces about it extensively. The 400 Blows is one of the most intensely touching stories ever made about young adolescents. And I'm not sure that sympathy is exactly the intended feeling that Truffaut wants us to feel. But I largely do not care about this young boy at the center of the story. Who is a stand-in for himself, right?
Yes.
This is semi-autobiographical.
Yes.
Rather than sort of finding himself in the ocean, he found himself in the movie theater. He was a delinquent who then eventually sort of latchkey kid, basically, who eventually found cinema, and that's kind of what saved him. But because it is a technically well-made movie, especially for a first-time director, I mean, it's masterful. But because I never give a shit about this kid, I never care about him. I never care about his life. I don't care about the French school system and how uncaring and unfeeling it was towards these children. It never gets me to buy in whatsoever. It leaves the proceedings rather unengaging for me. And the other issue that I have with this movie and it's not this movie's fault, but is that they've never stopped making this movie. Of all the films on our list this week, and for the first 5 of the Criterion Collection, this is the one that feels the most akin to contemporary filmmaking.
Yes.
The 400 Blows, as much as I can say that the Seven Samurai is like the provenience of so much of what we enjoy about movies. And yes, it has been remade multiple times. Obviously, Magnificent Seven, and Magnificent Seven's been remade a bunch of times. But
and you can see its influence in other films. You can see it in Lady Bird, The Edge of 17.
Yes.
Yeah, you could see it.
Yes. Any coming of age movie that's ever been made is a riff on 400 Blows, is what it feels like, right?
Especially if you were
and Boyhood and all this sort of shit. And it's like, I've sat through this so many fucking times. Yes. That it's like art house indie movies are frequently producing melancholy coming of age dramas about sad kids from broken lives who are forgotten, shunned by society. Even there's like After Sun has it's a little bit more overt in the fact that, we kind of get the juxtaposition between her reminiscing on this sort of stuff, but it's like, and I love some of those movies, but it's rather than having it, them extracting elements from the 400 Blows and then innovate on them, which obviously some movies have. This one feels the most directly just copied. Like it feels the most directly like we're still getting this exact movie over and over and over again. Every fucking film festival is filled with Truffaut wannabes and 400 Blow wannabes. And I'm tired of it, which is not this film's problem. If anything, it might be to this film's credit, but to me, it was to my detriment as a viewer of it. I watched this maybe 10 years ago for the first time. It did nothing for me then. It did even less for me now. I recognize it's a good movie, but I could only give it an 8 out of 10. It's my worst of the week. It's good, but it doesn't hold up to the rest of these movies. What? Tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I'm also seeing it from the perspective of how Truffaut was growing up, because he was growing up when Paris was under siege during the Nazi period, because it was 1932 he was born.
Yeah.
So his noncompliance with authority was very much being noncompliant towards fascism, and that ideas of that, which since he takes in the present day, I think that's sort of lost, but I think that the remnants of that are still there, where it is kind of that idea that noncompliance is actually kind of a good thing, that you shouldn't actually follow what all adults tell you to do. And the parents are abusive. I mean, they shame him and humiliate him in public for being school. They break their promises all the time. So he feels he has no one to turn to. So he turns to the terrible influences. I felt that for him. I think especially, I grew up in the South. I'm still in the South. And especially as a queer child growing up, queer teenager, and you feel that, and especially as a woman, you feel that you're forced to comply to other ways that you don't feel are fair or justified. And so I could actually understand what Antoine was going through. And I could see that humanization, because mostly those kids like him, they're bullies. They're not actually the protagonists of their films, especially during that time. And this was also during a time where the 50s in America had the Teens Gone Wild, teenage delinquent films. Rebel Without a Cause, Blackboard Jungle. So
Blackboard Jungle.
So we had the
the idea of the teenager was essentially created then, and then immediately after its creation, it was like, well, there's these things called teenagers, and they're monsters.
Basically, yes, these monsters.
I'm with you. I understand its place in history, as this is an early portrayal of essentially like delinquent children are often the product of neglect and the product of a brokenness in society, and so they're
and no one treats them like people. They're treated like property, which we're seeing now with the book bans, because these parents, my child will not think any differently than me, because they are my child and I will control what they watch, what they consume, everything. They don't see him as autonomous.
And so I totally
figures.
understand that, like, this movie is the sort of like a sensitive portrayal that's saying maybe kids act out because there's something wrong with society, not because there's something wrong with these kids. I totally get that. I've seen it 50 million times.
Yeah, I know, because it needs to be repeated, apparently. So,
and it's a worthy message, and it's a well-made movie. It's not a bad movie, but for these types of movies to work, where is a very personal portrayal of a person, whereas to contrast it with Amarcord, which is a very personal story, but the personal is made collectivistically. An intimate story is being told through this sort of shaggy dog narrative throughout this whole town, and the town represents his experience. This is very much like this one kid is Truffaut, and this is what it was like to be a youth in France, and during fascism, and we have a problem with the education system, and we have a problem with latchkey kids, and we blame the kids, but it's really our. I totally get all that. You got to get me to care about the kid. I don't care about this kid.
I can understand. I think it's the
fuck this kid.
The Catcher in the Rye problem. Because there's so many people who read the book. He's like, he's whiny. I don't like him. It's like he doesn't even like himself. That's kind of the point. Yeah. I think that's the point, that I don't think you're really supposed to like Holden Caulfield that much, because he doesn't even like himself. He's filled with self-loathing, and I think Antoine is too. And but I can sympathize with him. And this was actually one of the first. This was one of the first films in international films I ever saw in a theater, because they were actually playing this at an indie theater, and I went to it as a teen. I convinced my friend to go see it with me. We were like 18 years old, no, like 17, 18 years old, and we just came and watched this movie.
This was 2 or 3 years ago.
2 or 3 years ago, barely. Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
So when I was watching it, and watching it in the cinema was just a whole different experience than watching it by yourself, and you're watching.
That could be too.
Yeah, yes, I think that also as well. It's the same thing with Lawrence of Arabia. I don't think you ever get the full experience of Lawrence of Arabia until you see it in 70 millimeter on the biggest screen you can see it in.
Yeah.
Which I did. And I was very, very lucky for that. And so yeah, and you're enraptured in this world, and you have to feel for this kid, but you also feel the frustration of the parents too, because I think there is a humanization of the adults, because they are just as clueless as he is, and they have how to really live.
What's your score? What's your rank for this one?
I think it's actually about a 9.4, so just right below Amarcord for me. So number 4.
That's your number 4. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. It is time for a recap. Coming in dead last for me is the 400 Blows, which I give an 8 out of 10. Coming number 4 is The Lady Vanishes, which I give a 9 out of 10. Coming number 3 is The Grand Illusion, which I give a 9.25 out of 10. Coming number 2 is Amarcord, which I give a 9.5 out of 10. And number 1, With the Samurai Sword, 1954's classic film. It's everything you love about movies. 7 Samurai, a 10 out of 10. Perfect film.
All right. And for me, coming in at number last, but certainly not least, Lady Vanishes, which I gave an 8 out of 10. And I believe it was 8 out of 10. Yeah. Still way above average for me. I'm going by the college metric here, so not the high school one. So it's like 80%. That's like a high B right there. And then coming in at number 4, 9 out of 10, La Grande Illusion. And coming in at number 3 for me, The 400 Blows, with Jean-Pierre in his first role. And then coming in at number 2 is Amarcord at 9.5. And of course, coming in at number 1, 7 Samurai with a score 10 out of 10. Perfect film, no changes, no cut.
All right, Molly, I've been wanting to do this for years. We finally got it done. You've lived up to the hype. You have one of the best curated Twitters that I follow. Get your plug in. What do you do? I know you write reviews. I know you're going through your 5th degree in graduate school.
I actually have already finished that, so hopefully I will.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so hopefully I won't need another degree. If it's so, I would do a PhD, and they would have to pay me to do it. So that will be a while from now if it happens, because I'm not paying for that. I would just, you got to pay me to get that. But yes.
Where can we find you? And when X/Twitter dies, and it may be dead by the time this episode comes out officially.
I do not.
When are you going to start your TikTok?
I do have a TikTok. I don't really post it because I am a person behind the camera. I am not really, even though I now have a new puppy, so I may just put her up on there. I may do that. Just have the with the Mandalorian. I would like to see the baby and just have her unveiled, just like do that meme. But you can find me on the website formerly known as Twitter at Raspberry Razz. And that's my dad. My dad's nickname is Razz, so that's why I take it from that. Besides also Razz right there.
Yep.
And you can also find me on Letterboxd at Molly Raspberry. And you can find me also, I have a WordPress site, Mollywood Writes at WordPress.com. And sometimes I also contribute to the film stage. So I've got a catalog of things I've done. I've done a review, I've done interviews, and mostly trailer stuff like that. So yeah. And I'm also on Instagram too. So yeah, under Molly Razz on Instagram.
I loved having you on. You're an incredible guest, incredibly knowledgeable. If you're ever willing to come back on, I'll have you talk about trash.
Yes, I do love trash too. I did an entire piece on John Waters' Female Trouble, which is my favorite John Waters film.
Nice. Maybe I haven't done a John Waters episode yet. You might have just given me an idea. All right. Now we're getting close to the time you have to leave. So we're going to end it here. But we're going to maybe have a little bit of overtime over on patreon.com/binge movies, where I'm going to ask Molly one question very quickly, and then we'll let her go. So until next time, binge on.